We are in our sermon series that we're calling Engage, where we are looking at the earliest Christians, this diverse, spirit-filled community that was devoted to the singular message that Jesus is risen, how this community engaged both with God and with the world around them. And this morning, we're going to be looking at how they engaged with suffering to heal it. And there's never really been a better time to talk about healing, because we saw this week how deeply our world is in need of it. There's 500 people who have been in Las Vegas hospitals this week looking for and hoping for and seeking physical healing. There's 50-some families of people who are grieving and in need of emotional healing. There's hundreds more across the country who are trying to process this traumatic event. And then there's our divided, conflict-oriented, blame-casting culture that's in need of relational healing. And then kind of wrapped around all of it is this deep awareness of spiritual need. When we're confronted with the kind of darkness that we've seen this week, we are aware of our need for spiritual healing as well. So the need for healing in all of its forms has never been more crystal clear in our focus than this morning. However, it is true every Sunday morning. There is always brokenness hanging around the temple. And a lot of times we just want to sort of pass by it. But our invitation this morning is to do what Peter and John did, which is to stop and look and engage with the brokenness that we see all around us or that we see within us. The early church, some people say that one of the most attractive things about this new small community was the different way that they engaged with suffering and with people who were suffering. There was something so attractive about how they moved towards it rather than running from it that made people want to be a part of this community. They showed themselves to be a community that was devoted to healing in all of its forms. And in our passage this morning, we see a need for healing in so many of its forms. The beggar is obviously in need of physical healing. He's been crippled since his birth, so he's never walked, he's never learned to ride a bike, he's never done any of the things that so many of us take for granted. He's never been able to work, so because of that, he has to be brought to this temple where he's left. So the physical need is readily apparent. It's like the big, huge iceberg that's out in the ocean that everyone can see and is obviously a problem, but underneath the iceberg, there's actually much, much more that's kind of submerged beneath the surface. Because along with his need for physical healing, there's a need for relational healing. I mean, he is brought to the temple, but then he is left alone. And he's excluded from the community that keeps on moving past him. And so there's this reality that he experiences along with his need for physical healing, which is a need for relational healing. Because at the time, it was generally thought that if something like this had happened to you physically, it was probably because of something that you had done. And so people would want to keep their distance, so as not to be associated with someone who was so clearly out of God's favor. There was a time in Jesus' ministry where they brought a man who had been blind from his birth, and they asked Jesus, so who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You can see the obvious assumption that somebody must have done something for him to deserve this. So there's this kind of cruel karma operating in the culture at the time, which assumes that if you are hurting, it means that God has left you somehow, and it's best not to be associated with those kinds of people. So this guy's got relational needs that need to be healed as well. And then tied in with those are this very interesting detail that Luke includes that I think points to a need for emotional healing as well. Because as he's begging. It seems that he is begging with downcast eyes. He's not even looking up. He sort of sees who's coming, but he's not even feeling like he's able to look them in the eyes. And so when Peter looks straight at him, as did John, Peter has to say, "Look at us," for him to even be able to raise his eyes. So you can see how this physical need for healing and this relational need for healing has kind of worked its way into him, which is so often what happens with shame when when we kind of internalize the accusations and the impressions of people around us. And sometimes we just sort of, as we work through the pain of that, we sometimes feel like we're stuck. This man felt stuck. He was basically given up. I mean, he's not asking for healing. He's just asking for money to make it to the next day when he can come and be brought to the temple to beg some more. So we've got a physical dimension of healing that's needed, a relational dimension of healing that's needed, an emotional dimension, and perhaps most apparent to him and least apparent to us is his need for spiritual healing. Because they didn't just bring him to the city gates where people were passing through and leave him there. They didn't just bring him to the marketplace where there would be a lot of people. There was a reason why he was left outside of the temple, and that's because he was not allowed to go in. People with that kind of brokenness were at the time thought to be not worthy, or not. God was too holy and too powerful to be surrounded by that kind of brokenness. And so there were all these rules about who could enter and who couldn't. And people who were lame were not even able to enter. So from his birth, every day of his life, he's painfully aware of what must have felt like a great distance between himself and God, because he's never been able to go in with the community and worship and pray. He's never been able to offer the sacrifices that were happening in the temple that would have atoned for his sin. So he must have felt very profoundly, day after day, this sense of gap and a need for healing in his spiritual life. He needed more healing than it first appeared. And so do we. We have these areas that are maybe really evident to us. Maybe we just got a grim diagnosis. Or maybe we've become aware of an addiction that is in control of us. Or maybe we're locked in some kind of cycle in our relationships of hurting people or being hurt. Or maybe we are working through the emotional pain of something that has happened to us a long time ago that wasn't our fault, but we still feel like is holding us back. And all of us, every single one of us, knows somewhere deep down, if we look, we feel this gap between us and God. We wonder if we're worthy, and we feel like we are in need of spiritual healing and cleansing and forgiveness. And for some of us, maybe it's all just wrapped up together, as it was for this man. So, he's in need of healing in a comprehensive way. And what God does through his people is address all of these and more. The healing that's offered through God's people in this little story is different than and deeper than the healing that he was asking for. Remember, he's just looking for money. But what he gets is healing at every level. If you look at what happens to him, he jumps to his feet and begins to walk. So we have healing in the physical dimension. He then went with them, so we're getting relational healing. All of a sudden, he's got this little community of people who are with him, and he goes into the temple courts where he's walking and jumping and praising God as he jumps for joy. So we have emotional, spiritual, relational, and physical healing all bound up together. And when this happens, people take notice. Verses 10 and 11 talk about how everybody sees this guy, recognizes him, runs to see what's happened. Because when we see a community of people who are engaging with suffering in this way and moving towards it to heal it and offering healing in a world of brokenness, that is something that people take notice of. It sparks curiosity. And then Peter responds to the curiosity in such an amazing way. Because he doesn't, what he does is he points away from himself. He says basically, what are you looking at us for? People of Israel, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or our own godliness we had made this man walk? I think what he's pointing at is that though he was convinced of that this call to be a part of healing, he also knew that healing was not in his hands. It was not some magical power that he was able to conjure up at will, that there was mystery to the power of God and how it was working itself through. And it had very little to do with him. It was not in his control. Why are you looking at us as though we had anything to do with this? And I think what's happening here is that Peter is kind of nudging us up against the mystery of healing. Because as we know, healing is something that we sometimes wish we had in our control. Sometimes we hear stories like this one of people being immediately and instantaneously healed, and there's nothing that you can point to that would seem to indicate why that would happen. And other times we have these long and excruciating stories of healing that seem to take forever, and you can point to exactly how the healing happened. It was through medicine and doctors and people caring for and coming alongside this person. And then sometimes, inexplicably, healing never seems to come. And we begin to wrestle with questions about God and his relationship to suffering that, frankly, I do not have satisfying answers to, and frankly, neither does anybody else. But what seems to be clear in what we're seeing in this passage this morning is that one thing is for sure, that God's power and presence and love do not necessarily correspond to whether he is choosing to heal or choosing not to heal. It's not so simple as if we are healthy, God loves us and is with us, and if we are hurting, then God has left us and forgotten us. God's power seems to be wrapping itself around this mystery of healing in a way that calls us to both come with great faith and confidence and great humility. This man experienced an incredible healing, and Peter wants to point at something else. He wants to point away from himself and away from the healing, actually, to something even bigger. This happens actually not several different places in the Bible. Not only in this particular case, but Peter's colleague, Paul, who was a super Christian if there ever was one, wrote much of the New Testament and started most of the churches that this community was forming. He had a very troubling affliction of some kind, a physical affliction that he called a thorn in his flesh. And it bothered him so much that he prayed again and again and again for God to heal it, to take it from him. And God never did. Throughout his whole ministry, he endured this suffering, and healing never came. But what did come was something that he heard from God, which he shared with some other Christians who lived in a city called Corinth in a letter that he wrote to them. And he said that he pleaded with God 3 times to take this thorn from him, and the answer he received is this: "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." So it seems that when God is healing this crippled man, he's doing something bigger than even the man can see. His healing is different and deeper than was even expected. And in this case, when God isn't healing, he's still doing something different and deeper than was even expected, somehow showing that his power is present in weakness, that somehow that brokenness is not an obstacle to God at work, but sometimes the way that God is at work. So then it's not just this crippled beggar and Paul, who experienced the kind of mystery of God's healing power in different ways, but Jesus himself at the end of his life, as he's facing some significant suffering that is undeserved, he's praying to his Father, and he's calling out to him, and he says this is how his disciple Mark remembers it. He says, Abba, Father, which is this incredibly intimate way of addressing God that no one actually dared to do except for Jesus, because he knew that God was with him. He says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. I know that everything is possible for you, so take this cup from me. I do not want what I see coming. And then he goes on to say, yet not what I will, but what you will. So here we have this mystery, this tension that's present both in our passage this morning and in Paul's life and in Jesus' own life, where God is up to something different and deeper. And the way that God sometimes answers our call, when we ask him for healing, he is sometimes up to something bigger and different. Paul sees him showing up in his weakness. Jesus calls out for this cup to be taken from him, and God does not take the cup from him. And he undergoes what looks for all the world like complete and total abandonment by God. And yet it's for the redemption and the salvation and the healing of the whole world. God is sometimes up to something different and deeper than we are even aware of when we ask. So I don't know what is the thing that's in front of you right now, or what's most present in your mind. If it's your need for physical healing or relational healing or emotional healing or spiritual healing. But the things we've seen so far is that God is wanting his people to be asking for his power to be made known. He wants us to ask for healing with the kind of confidence that Peter showed, with the kind of confidence that Paul showed, and with the kind of confidence that Jesus says when he says, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. And he's wanting us to see that this reality of brokenness is not a sign of God's displeasure necessarily. It's not a sign of God's punishment upon us. It is actually much, much more than that. It's the way that God shows up in our lives, even if it's not in a way that we expect. So we can't coordinate our health and our happiness with God's pleasure, or our suffering and our pain with God's displeasure. There is mystery that we come up against where we just say to God, take this from me, yet not as I will, but as you will, because your grace is sufficient for me. That's this tension that God is calling us to. And he's calling his people to engage with suffering in a different way, to move towards it rather than moving away from it. I mean, this beggar was there every day. And every day, hundreds, if not thousands of people walked by him. And I'm sure that some of them had feelings of sympathy in their hearts. And then I'm sure that others of them even actually maybe gave him what he was asking for and threw some spare change his way. And then I'm sure that there were others who decided to take a different door in because they didn't want to see the brokenness that was all around, perhaps because it reminded them of some of the ways that they were bound up and crippled. But Peter and John stop and look right at it, right at him, right at his brokenness, right at his suffering, and they invite him to look at them, and they move towards the suffering rather than away from it. And I think this kind of engagement is what God continues to call the people of God to do, both then and now. Except it's not just that we are supposed to look around at everybody else's brokenness and see how we can help. We're not just the confident, faithful disciples who can boldly offer healing. we also are called to boldly ask for it in our own lives because we are just as much the crippled beggar who needs to be made whole. When Peter begins to explain or talk about or unpack this healing, it's kind of funny because first he says, this doesn't have to do with us. This doesn't have to do with me and my power or my godliness. And then when he wants to talk about healing, the source of the healing that he begins to describe is the cross of Jesus Christ. That's what he starts talking about. In verse 13, he says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. You handed him over to be killed. We could read this as we. We handed him over to be killed. We disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. We disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to us. We killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this. And it's by faith in the name of Jesus, in his name and the faith that comes through him, that we experience this kind of comprehensive healing in our physical lives, in our emotional and relational and spiritual lives. It all comes from the work of Jesus Christ on the cross because he took on a human body. He took on a human body in order to suffer in that human body, in order to make a way of healing for those who are suffering in their physical bodies, a way of healing that actually death can't even defeat. If your healing can heal death, that's a final and complete and comprehensive kind of healing. Jesus was abandoned by all of his friends and everyone who cared about him. He was abandoned by his people in order to create a new community of people who felt abandoned and alone. So his death saves us in the physical realm. It saves us in the relational realm. It offers healing in both of those places. And he was accused and mocked and put to shame in order to make a way of healing for people like you and me who know what it means to be ashamed, who know what it means to hear accusation and judgment. Jesus became sin. He took all of our private sins upon him in a public way so that we would experience healing in the deepest, darkest parts of ourselves that no one sees. Physical, emotional, relational, spiritual. The cross of Jesus Christ offers us healing in all of these ways. So if you are facing that grim diagnosis, or you're looking at that addiction that you can't figure out how you're going to beat it, remember that Jesus suffered in his body so that you might experience some healing. And if you're locked in that relational sense of isolation and distance, remember that Jesus was abandoned so that you could be healed in your relational life. If you're suffering from panic attacks or anxiety from some trauma that's happened to you, remember that Jesus took your shame so that you could experience healing there. And if you know deep down inside that your anger or your fear or your lust or your shame is crippling you, know that Jesus took that upon you to make you worthy so that you can enter the temple and be one of the people of God in his presence. Not because of your own power or your own godliness, but because of the work of Jesus Christ. We are all in need of that kind of healing. We are all in need of being brought into the place where we are made worthy by the blood of Jesus so that we can leap for joy at the healing that we've experienced. This is what we're called into, not just to offer to others, but to ask for ourselves in the pain and suffering that we experience. There's a woman named Katie who is kind of connected in certain ways with our community. She's a cousin to somebody in my group, and she's got 2 young kids who are a part of our preschool community. And about 16 months ago, Katie slipped into a coma that didn't look good. The diagnosis was that she'd probably never speak, and she'd probably never be able to move, and she may not even ever regain consciousness. This is not a story of somebody standing up out of the hospital bed and walking out like we read about. This is one of those other kinds of healing. I was talking to her sister earlier this week, and she was describing to me ways that they really have seen, and they're calling it healing, the way that God has been at work, like she's awake and she's conscious a lot more than they said that she was going to be, and she's even been able, those vocal cords that weren't supposed to work are beginning to enable her to speak some. And most powerfully, one of the stories was that Katie was asked, do you feel God's presence with you? Are you hearing from God? Do you sense him? And Katie responded with moving her body like this, in a way that she was never supposed to. I was talking to her sister earlier this week, and the reason I want to share the story is not because it's a story of somebody hopping up out of the hospital bed, but because it's a story of of people entering into and engaging in a healing way with the kind of posture that we're describing. Because Katie's sister said this to me. She goes, I pray every day that God would heal her and that she would stand up and walk out. Everything is possible for me. Take this cup from me, is what her sister's praying. But she says, but even if he doesn't, I know that everything's going to be okay because God is with her and God is for her. His power is made perfect in weakness. God is up to something different and deeper. So this is the kind of engagement that I believe we as the people of God are called to. Not easy answers, not simplistic solutions, but looking at the suffering that's around us and engaging with it with confidence in God and with an open-handedness to know that this is not under our control. To pray, take this cup from me, and to pray, your will be done. I need to be healed, and your healing may be different and deeper than what I'm even asking. It would be weird, I think, for us to just talk about engaging in healing as a kind of mental exercise. So we want to actually now move into a time where we engage with the suffering and brokenness and the need of healing that we bring in to this room today, the brokenness that's at the temple today.